Opening scene: dense jungle, early dawn mist, faint sound of distant gunfire. Smoke rises in the distance, silhouetting palm trees. Imagine standing in the pitch-black jungle, your hands gripping a weapon, your heart hammering in your chest, knowing that in a few hours, 3,000 battle-hardened Japanese soldiers will descend on your position. You are not alone. 840 Marines, tired, hungry, and scarred from weeks of combat, surround you, but the odds are staggering. Every decision, every shot, every heartbeat could be your last. This is Guadalcanal, August 1942, where courage, strategy, and sheer human endurance collided in a fight that would become legendary. Visual: animated map of Guadalcanal highlighting Henderson Field, overlaid with numbers 840 versus 3,000. Henderson Field, a small airstrip carved into the dense jungle, was the prize everyone wanted. For the Allies, it was a critical foothold in the Pacific, a lifeline for controlling sea lanes and launching air attacks against Japanese forces. Losing it could mean strategic disaster, extending Japanese reach deep into the Solomon Islands and threatening Australia itself. Visual/B-roll: close-up of Henderson Field, planes taxiing, Marines setting up sandbags. The 840 Marines defending the airfield were a mixture of seasoned veterans and fresh recruits, a patchwork of men from across America, each with their own fears and motivations. They were outnumbered almost 4-1, facing an enemy trained in jungle warfare, who had already crushed opponents across China, New Guinea, and the Pacific Islands. Visual: Marines checking weapons, tightening straps, mud-streaked faces, rain falling. As night fell, tension in the jungle grew almost palpable. Every snapping branch, every rustle of leaves could signal the approach of Japanese forces. The Marines dug trenches and foxholes, reinforced barriers with sandbags, and carefully laid barbed wire across key choke points. Every inch of ground was fortified, every decision meticulously calculated. Survival depended on strategy, teamwork, and nerves of steel. Visual: close-ups of hands placing barbed wire, soldiers peering through the rain, glowing muzzle flashes in the distance. Commanders understood the stakes. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Red Mike Edson, a Marine whose leadership would become the stuff of legend, coordinated the defensive positions. His voice, firm and calm, carried orders through the chaos: machine guns set here, sniper posts here, artillery ready on the ridges. Every man had a role, every action mattered. Retreat was not an option. Visual: animated overlay of defensive positions, machine gun arcs, lines of trenches. The enemy would not wait. Intelligence reports had confirmed that the Japanese planned a two-night assault, using stealth, infiltration, and sheer brute force. They would attack under cover of darkness, aiming to breach weak points, isolate small groups, and roll up the defensive line. It was a calculated gamble, and the Marines knew it. Every man braced for impact, fully aware that one mistake could be catastrophic. Visual: Japanese troops moving through thick jungle, bayonets glinting under moonlight. Meanwhile, supplies were limited. Food, ammunition, and medical resources were scarce. Marines improvised, rationing carefully, sharing bullets, water, and first aid supplies. They were determined to hold the line no matter what, motivated by camaraderie, duty, and an understanding that the lives of their brothers in arms depended on their actions. Visual: soldiers sharing water, bandaging wounds, checking ammunition. The night before the first assault, some Marines tried to rest, but sleep was fleeting. The jungle teemed with noise. Distant roars of artillery, the snapping of branches, and the eerie calls of nocturnal animals. Every sound made hearts race. Letters from home, photos tucked in pockets, whispered prayers. These were silent companions amidst the chaos. Visual: close-up of a letter in a soldier's pocket, dog tags, flickering candlelight in a foxhole. Then, the first wave began. The Japanese moved with precision, exploiting shadows, using the terrain to their advantage. The Marines opened fire, bullets tearing through the jungle night. Every shot echoed like a cannon, every scream a reminder of the stakes. Survival required courage, accuracy, and timing. Hesitation could mean death. Visual, slow motion of machine gun fire, muzzle flashes lighting up the foggy jungle. Amidst this chaos, individual acts of bravery stood out. A lone Marine manned a machine gun against a flanking squad. Another dragged a wounded comrade to safety while bullets whizzed past. Officers ran from trench to trench, shouting orders, coordinating artillery fire, and maintaining the morale of men on the edge of exhaustion. Visual/B-roll, close-up of muddy boots running, hand signals between soldiers, smoke and fire in the background. Time seemed to stretch and compress simultaneously. Seconds felt like minutes and minutes like hours. The enemy's numbers seemed overwhelming, yet the Marines held firm. Each defensive position, each volley of bullets, each grenade thrown became a crucial piece of a larger strategy to survive until reinforcements or dawn could bring relief. Visual, bird's-eye view of jungle with overlapping fields of fire, grenades exploding. Smoke rising. By the first morning, both sides were exhausted, yet the intensity of the conflict had only escalated. Casualties mounted, yet the Marines' discipline and resilience allowed them to hold their ground. Their small numbers, combined with fierce determination and tactical ingenuity, created an almost impenetrable defense against a numerically superior force. Visual, panoramic shot of battlefield at dawn, Marines regrouping, smoke clearing, wounded being assisted. This was not just a battle for ground, it was a battle for honor, survival, and the future of the Pacific Campaign. Every bullet fired, every order shouted, and every life lost shaped the outcome of history. The story of 840 Marines defying 3,000 Japanese soldiers for 2 relentless nights is a testament to human courage, strategy, and the will to survive against insurmountable odds. Visual/B-roll, slow motion of exhausted soldiers standing firm, jungle smoke, sun breaking through the canopy. And as the second night approached, the tension was nearly unbearable. The men knew that the enemy would return with renewed fury, that every mistake could be fatal. Yet, amidst fear and exhaustion, there was resolve, brotherhood, and the determination to hold the line at all costs. Visual, close-up of hand on a rifle, sweat dripping, eyes scanning the darkness, silent nods between Marines. Etched in mud, blood, and courage is where ordinary men became legends, where the impossible became reality, and where the will to survive shaped the course of a war that would change the Pacific forever. Visual, panoramic aerial map of the Solomon Islands, slowly zooming in on Guadalcanal. Overlay, Strategic Pacific Theater, 1942. By mid-1942, the Pacific War had reached a critical turning point. Japan had expanded across Southeast Asia and the Pacific with terrifying speed, capturing islands, ports, and airfields. The Allies faced an urgent threat. Japanese control of Guadalcanal would give them the ability to dominate shipping lanes, threaten Australia and New Zealand, and launch air raids across the South Pacific. Every Allied command understood that holding or losing Guadalcanal could dramatically shift the balance of the war. Visual/B-roll, Japanese aircraft flying low over islands, soldiers unloading cargo, maps highlighting strategic positions. The Japanese had begun constructing an airfield on Guadalcanal, later named Henderson Field, to strengthen their operational reach. This airfield, once completed, would allow them to launch aircraft to control nearby sea lanes and provide direct support to Japanese naval operations. The Allied High Command understood its importance. Denying the Japanese this airfield could cripple their regional dominance. Visual, time-lapse of Japanese engineers constructing airstrips, cranes, and bulldozers, planes taxiing. In response, the United States launched Operation Watchtower, the first major offensive against Japanese-held territory in the Pacific. On August 7, 1942, over 11,000 Marines landed on Guadalcanal, facing surprisingly light resistance initially. The Marines quickly secured the beaches and moved to capture Henderson Field, but the Japanese were not far behind. Reinforcements were on the way, and the Marines' success would soon be tested in the harshest conditions imaginable. Visual, Marines landing on beaches under early morning sun, unloading crates of weapons, setting up defensive positions. Among the defenders of Henderson Field were 840 Marines, tasked with holding the perimeter. They were a mix of veterans and green recruits, all aware that their mission was to prevent the Japanese from retaking the airfield at any cost. Their enemy numbered 3,000 soldiers, battle-hardened and skilled in jungle warfare, many of whom had fought across China, New Guinea, and other Pacific islands. Visual/B-roll, close-ups of Marines inspecting weapons, reloading ammunition, and fortifying trenches. Guadalcanal's terrain was unforgiving. Thick jungle, mangrove swamps, and jagged ridges made movement slow and visibility near zero. The Japanese used the jungle to their advantage, approaching silently through dense foliage. In response, the Marines dug foxholes, reinforced machine gun positions, and prepared overlapping fields of fire. Each small ridge and cluster of trees became a defensive strongpoint. Visual, animated overlay of defensive positions, machine gun arcs, and sniper vantage points. Supplies were a constant concern. Food, water, ammunition, and medical supplies were all limited. The Marines had to ration everything carefully, sharing bullets, first aid kits, and water. Every Marine understood that conserving resources was just as important as firing their weapons accurately. Shortages would quickly become deadly if the Japanese exploited them. Visual, close-ups of soldiers sharing rations, checking ammo belts, bandaging each other. Commanders, including Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Red Mike Edson, coordinated the defense meticulously. Every position was assessed, machine guns were set at choke points, trenches were dug along ridges, and snipers were placed at concealed observation points. The goal was simple: use every advantage to withstand attacks far beyond their numbers. Retreat was not an option. Visual, animated command overlay, Edson giving orders, signals being relayed through trenches. The Japanese had a clear plan. They favored night attacks and infiltration tactics, moving silently to bypass defenses and attack from unexpected directions. Their strategy relied on shock, surprise, and overwhelming firepower to fracture the defensive line quickly. These soldiers were experts in jungle combat, capable of moving silently and striking without warning. Visual/B-roll, Japanese troops moving through dense undergrowth at night, bayonets reflecting moonlight. The Marines, however, were not defenseless. Carefully placed machine guns covered all key approaches, artillery could be called to strike concentrated enemy groups, and officers had trained their men to anticipate infiltration. Courage, ingenuity, and discipline became the most important weapons in their arsenal. Visual, machine gun crews firing at targets, Marines signaling artillery strikes, soldiers in camouflage observing enemy movement. Communication, however, was a constant struggle. Radios often failed in the dense jungle. Officers relied on runners, signal flares, and hand signals to transmit orders, risking exposure to enemy fire. Despite these challenges, the Marines maintained coordination, using discipline and adaptability to stay one step ahead. Visual, close-ups of signal flares lighting up the canopy, Marines sprinting with messages through mud. The psychological strain on the Marines was immense. Sleep deprivation, fear, and stress combined to test their limits. The Japanese were relentless, attacking with precision and ferocity. The Marines had to maintain focus, conserve energy, and support each other. Letters from home, personal photos, and shared stories became mental lifelines for each man, helping them cling to hope amid the chaos. Visual, soldiers holding letters, checking dog tags, exchanging determined nods. As August 21st approached, preparations reached their peak. Defensive positions were fortified, scouts were deployed, artillery was primed, and every Marine knew his role. The stage was set for the first night of the assault, a trial that would test courage, endurance, and tactical skill. Visual, Marines bracing in trenches, machine guns ready, the jungle alive with night sounds. The first Japanese attack would be brutal. The Marines' limited numbers meant every shot, every grenade, and every defensive maneuver counted. Success would not be measured in glory, it would be measured in survival, in holding Henderson Field against impossible odds. Visual, bird's eye view of defensive lines, jungle smoke, flashes of gunfire, grenade explosions. This background sets the stage for the legendary confrontation. The combination of terrain, supply constraints, overwhelming enemy numbers, and psychological pressure created a crucible that would forge heroes. The story of these 840 Marines holding off 3,000 Japanese soldiers is more than a tale of warfare. It is a story of ingenuity, courage, and the human spirit in its most extreme form. Visual/B-roll. Fade to Marines' determined faces, jungle smoke clearing at dawn, distant sounds of enemy movements. As night fell over Guadalcanal, the defenders held their positions with grim determination. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and in unfamiliar terrain. Yet, through discipline, preparation, and unwavering resolve, the Marines prepared for what would become 2 nights of relentless combat that would etch their names into history. Visual. Nightfall over dense Guadalcanal jungle, shadows stretching across foxholes, distant rumble of artillery. The night of August 21, 1942, had arrived. Tension hung thick in the humid jungle air, and the 840 Marines braced themselves for the onslaught they had been anticipating for weeks. Every man knew the stakes: hold Henderson Field at all costs, or the strategic balance in the Pacific could shift catastrophically. Their positions were fortified, their weapons primed, and their nerves stretched taut like the strings of a violin, ready to snap. Visual. Close-ups of hands gripping rifles, sweat dripping, eyes scanning darkness, artillery shells in the distance. At precisely midnight, the first Japanese wave struck. A battalion of well-trained soldiers moved with terrifying precision, silently approaching the Marines' line. Using the jungle's dense foliage as cover, they attempted to flank the American positions, avoiding the open choke points where machine guns had been set. The tension was immediate. Marines' nerves screamed as a single misstep could trigger disaster. Visual. Slow motion of Japanese troops advancing, bayonets glinting in moonlight, close-up of anxious Marines. The initial exchange of fire was deafening. Machine guns tore through the underbrush, tracer rounds lighting the night like violent fireworks. Grenades exploded in clumps of bamboo, sending dirt, leaves, and splinters into the humid air. Every Marine on the line became a fulcrum of survival, each act of bravery holding back waves of enemy forces. Visual/B-roll. Muzzle flashes, grenades exploding, Marines shouting orders, Japanese soldiers falling back. In the midst of the chaos, Lieutenant Colonel Edson moved from foxhole to foxhole, shouting commands, directing artillery, and calming panicked troops. "Hold the line. Don't give an inch," he bellowed over the din of battle. Each order was a lifeline, each instruction a thread keeping the line intact. Visual. Animated overlay of defensive positions under assault, red dots for enemy movement, yellow for Marines. The Japanese pressed relentlessly, using infiltration tactics to get behind the first lines. A small group of Marines found themselves surrounded, cut off from ammunition and communication. One Marine, a young private, stood atop a mound, firing his rifle until it jammed, then switched to grenades. His actions bought precious minutes, allowing others to regroup and push the enemy back. Visual/B-roll. Close-up of private firing, dirt flying from grenade blasts, comrades reinforcing positions. Meanwhile, the jungle itself became a weapon. Thick vines and uneven terrain slowed the Japanese advance, funneling them into kill zones prepped with overlapping fields of machine gun fire. Every ridge, every fallen tree, became an advantage for the defenders. The Marines' intimate knowledge of their positions turned what seemed like a desperate situation into a tactical edge. Visual. Bird's-eye animated overlay of defensive zones, traps, and kill zones. By the second hour of the attack, casualties began to mount. The Marines were exhausted, some wounded, yet their determination never wavered. Medics dashed through gunfire, patching bullet wounds, bandaging lacerations, and keeping men in the fight. Their courage often meant risking their own lives to save others. Visual. Close-ups of medics applying bandages, pulling wounded to safety, expressions of pain and focus. Despite being outnumbered nearly 4-1, the Marines executed counterattacks with precision. Small squads would push forward under covering fire, recapturing trenches and taking down Japanese soldiers who had breached the lines. Coordination and communication were key, even under the thunder of artillery and the chaos of jungle combat. Visual: slow motion of Marines charging under fire, hand-to-hand combat, bayonet clashes. The Japanese, shocked by the Marines' resilience, adapted their tactics. Night attacks became bolder, employing flamethrowers and small artillery pieces to weaken defensive positions. Yet the Americans held. Every man knew that losing ground was unacceptable. Edson himself personally directed machine gun fire, relayed orders to artillery units, and reinforced key points with his own squad. His presence galvanized the Marines, turning fear into controlled fury. Visual/B-roll: Edson shouting orders, directing fire, Marines responding immediately, flamethrowers in the distance. As dawn approached, the first wave of Japanese forces had been repelled, but the fighting was far from over. The Marines were bloodied, their uniforms torn, faces smeared with mud and sweat. Yet their spirits remained intact. They had survived the initial assault, but the enemy would return with renewed vigor. Visual: sun rising over jungle canopy, smoke drifting, Marines regrouping, counting casualties, reinforcing trenches. The second night brought even greater intensity. Japanese forces launched a multi-pronged attack, attempting to overwhelm the Marines through sheer numbers and stealth. They infiltrated areas previously considered secure, forcing hand-to-hand combat in trenches and foxholes. Every engagement was life or death, every move critical. Visual: close-up of knives clashing, rifle but striking, soldiers grappling in mud and rain. One of the most dramatic moments occurred near the southern ridge. A squad of Marines, pinned down by a heavy machine gun nest, faced almost certain annihilation. With no time for hesitation, Corporal James "Jimmy" Malone sprinted across open terrain under fire, tossing grenades to disable the nest. His action saved dozens of Marines, bought critical time, and became one of the many acts of heroism etched into Guadalcanal history. Visual: slow motion of Malone throwing grenades, enemy soldiers retreating, Marines cheering. Throughout the night, snipers picked off advancing soldiers, artillery struck enemy concentrations, and Marines rotated positions to keep their lines strong despite fatigue. Exhaustion was universal, yet adrenaline, training, and sheer willpower allowed them to fight through impossible conditions. Visual/B-roll: snipers in trees, artillery exploding in distance, rotating soldiers replacing fatigued comrades. By the second dawn, after more than 24 hours of continuous combat, the Marines had held every position. Their numbers were diminished, but the Japanese assault had failed to breach Henderson Field. The Americans had not just survived, they had demonstrated tactical genius, discipline, and the raw courage that would define their legacy. Visual: smoke rising from battlefield, Marines surveying terrain, sunrise over jungle, exhausted but standing tall. This two-night ordeal proved that 840 determined Marines could hold off 3,000 attackers using strategy, courage, and teamwork. Each action, from a single grenade toss to coordinated artillery strikes, contributed to a larger story of survival against overwhelming odds. Visual/B-roll: panoramic battlefield, slow motion of surviving Marines embracing, distant enemy retreating, flags waving. The twists, surprises, and consequences that would test the Marines' limits even further. Every heroism and every loss from these nights would ripple through the rest of the Guadalcanal campaign, influencing strategy, morale, and history itself. Visual: dense jungle at dawn, mist rolling over the trees, Marines moving cautiously, alert eyes scanning the horizon. The first night of combat had tested the Marines' endurance to the limit, but the second night brought an unexpected twist that no one could have fully anticipated. The Japanese, battered by earlier attacks, did not retreat. Instead, they regrouped under the cover of darkness, moving with a calculated strategy that sought to exploit every potential weakness in the Marine lines. Their plan was bold: infiltrate, flank, and overrun positions that seemed secure after the previous day's skirmishes. Visual. Overhead map animation showing enemy infiltration routes weaving around American positions. It started quietly, almost imperceptibly. Small groups of Japanese soldiers crept through the dense undergrowth, avoiding open paths and circumventing machine gun nests. Their stealth was unnerving. The sound of snapping twigs, rustling leaves, and distant gunfire created a tense, almost claustrophobic atmosphere for the defenders. For the Marines, every rustle could mean death. Yet, discipline prevailed. They held their positions, listening, watching, waiting. Visual/B-roll. Shadows moving between trees, Marines gripping rifles, eyes scanning the darkness, cautious footsteps. In the southern sector, the first real shock occurred. A squad of Japanese soldiers attempted to bypass a key machine gun nest by attacking from behind. The position was crucial for covering a wide-open approach to Henderson Field, and losing it could have triggered a domino effect across the perimeter. A young private, barely 19, stood alone in the nest, firing with unwavering focus. Tracer rounds lit up the misty jungle, and despite being outnumbered, he held the attackers at bay long enough for reinforcements to arrive. His courage turned what could have been a breakthrough into a critical defensive victory, a testament to the Marines' resilience. Visual. Slow motion of private firing, muzzle flashes cutting through fog, enemy soldiers retreating under fire. Meanwhile, the Japanese launched an unexpected flamethrower assault combined with small artillery strikes in the central sector. Thick smoke and fire erupted in the jungle, creating confusion and threatening to push Marines back from critical positions. The sudden combination of firepower and terrain advantage forced officers to act decisively. Lieutenant Colonel Edson moved through mud and smoke, shouting orders, redistributing ammunition, and personally reinforcing trenches that were in danger of being overrun. His presence became a living anchor for the defenders, instilling calm and determination in men teetering on the edge of exhaustion. Visual. Edson running through jungle, rain and mud soaking him, directing machine gun fire, Marines responding. The terrain itself added to the drama. Torrential rain turned the jungle floor into a quagmire. Movement became slow and grueling, every step risked slipping or losing balance under enemy fire. Yet the Marines adapted, turning fallen logs, mud banks, and jagged ridges into makeshift barriers and ambush points. They used the natural environment to amplify their defensive advantage, offsetting the Japanese numerical superiority. Visual/B-roll. Soldiers struggling through mud, setting traps, using trees for cover, artillery shells exploding nearby. One of the most dramatic moments unfolded on the eastern ridge. Japanese soldiers attempted a coordinated flanking maneuver aimed at encircling a vital machine gun nest. Communications were disrupted by the storm and smoke, and ammunition was running low. For nearly an hour, the fate of the Marines' position hung in the balance. Yet, through quick thinking, soldiers repositioned themselves, set up crossfire zones, and used grenades with precision to repel the enemy. The successful defense here exemplified how preparation, leadership, and courage could defy overwhelming odds. Visual. Animated map overlay of flank attempt, Marines repositioning under fire, grenades exploding, enemy retreating. Individual acts of heroism continued to define the night. Corporal Thompson, recognizing that a squad of Japanese soldiers had infiltrated a section of the line, grabbed grenades and charged alone into the enemy group. His audacity disoriented the attackers, allowing his squad to trap and neutralize them. Elsewhere, medics braved direct fire to retrieve the wounded, bandaging them in mud-soaked trenches while bullets whizzed overhead. Each small action compounded into a larger defensive victory, demonstrating the power of courage in small, decisive acts. Visual/B-roll. Thompson throwing grenades, medics dragging wounded to cover, Marines firing from reinforced positions. Adding to the unexpected twists, a rare and surprising moment occurred. Defectors from the Japanese side provided intelligence. These men, unwilling to continue under heavy casualties, disclosed enemy positions, movements, and tactics. Using this intelligence, the Marines were able to anticipate infiltration points and strengthen weak areas of their line. This unpredictable development became a turning point that further bolstered the defenders' ability to repel attacks. Visual. Shadowed figures speaking to Marines, maps spread out, soldiers marking enemy positions. The night intensified as both sides fought in close quarters. Jungle combat was brutal and intimate. Bayonets clashed, rifles were wielded at point-blank range, and hand-to-hand fighting erupted in trenches and muddy ravines. Explosions from grenades and artillery shook the ground, sending debris into the humid night air. Every second demanded focus, courage, and stamina. Exhaustion was universal, yet the Marines adapted, using teamwork and discipline to turn chaos into organized counterattacks. Visual. Slow motion of hand-to-hand combat, grenades detonating, machine gun crews firing into jungle cover. By the final hours before dawn, the Japanese attempted a last desperate assault, concentrating forces on the southern perimeter. The Marines, though physically and mentally drained, held their ground. Through coordinated fire, careful positioning, and sheer determination, they repelled the final wave, proving that strategy, courage, and endurance could overcome overwhelming numbers. Visual/B-roll. Sunrise over battlefield, smoke clearing, Marines standing tall amidst debris, Japanese forces retreating. As dawn broke, the Marines were bloodied, exhausted, and diminished in number, but they had held every position on Henderson Field. The enemy had failed, not for lack of effort, but because human courage, ingenuity, and unity triumphed over brute force. The twists and unexpected turns of this battle, the infiltration attempts, flamethrower assaults, artillery strikes, flanking maneuvers, and even the rare intelligence from defectors, shaped the course of the Guadalcanal campaign. Visual. Panoramic battlefield, smoke rising, Marines regrouping, medics attending to wounded, flags waving. The second night revealed a simple but profound truth. Victory on Guadalcanal was not solely about numbers or weapons. It was about leadership, adaptability, and the unwavering will to survive. Each Marine had faced moments where fear could have consumed him, yet their combined resolve held the line against nearly impossible odds. Visual/B-roll. Close-ups of exhausted soldiers, muddy faces, comrades supporting each other, final defensive positions secured. By surviving this night, the Marines had demonstrated that, even in the face of overwhelming enemy force, human courage and strategy could bend the odds of history. Visual. Dawn breaking over Henderson Field, smoke rising from the jungle, a battered yet resolute line of Marines standing alert. The 2 nights of relentless combat were over. Henderson Field still stood in American hands, and the 840 Marines, outnumbered nearly 4-1, had done the impossible. But victory was not measured solely by holding the airfield. It was measured in the courage, strategy, and sheer determination that had allowed them to survive against 3,000 Japanese soldiers. Every Marine, from the youngest private to Lieutenant Colonel Edson himself, had become part of a story that would echo through history. Visual/B-roll. Wide shot of Marines surveying the battlefield, smoke drifting, sun reflecting off rifles and helmets. The aftermath was sobering. Casualties were heavy, and the jungle bore the marks of 2 nights of brutal combat. Craters from artillery shells, shattered trees, and abandoned weapons scattered across the mud-soaked terrain. Medics worked tirelessly, tending to the wounded while others buried the fallen. Yet, even in the chaos and tragedy, the Marines' spirit remained unbroken. They had held the line, and their resilience would shape the outcome of the Pacific Campaign. Visual. Medics treating wounded, Marines carrying stretchers, faces etched with exhaustion and determination. The Japanese forces, meanwhile, had retreated to regroup. Their assault had failed not for lack of skill, but because the Marines had outmatched them with preparation, ingenuity, and unyielding bravery. The defenders had turned impossible odds into a testament of human courage. Each trench held, every machine gun crew surviving the night, every sniper keeping vigilant eyes on enemy movement, had contributed to a historic victory under fire. Visual/B-roll. Panoramic battlefield, enemy soldiers retreating into jungle shadows, smoke curling into the sky, This battle also revealed the profound role of leadership. Lieutenant Colonel Edson's decisions, moving to the most threatened positions, redistributing resources, and inspiring his men under fire, had been critical to survival. His presence, combined with the quick thinking of Corporal Thompson, Private Malone, and countless other Marines, had ensured that Henderson Field remained in American hands despite near-overwhelming odds. Visual: Edson speaking to soldiers, squad leaders directing fire, Marines nodding resolutely. Beyond leadership, the psychological resilience of the Marines became a defining factor. Exhausted, under constant threat, and witnessing death around them, each Marine faced a personal crucible. Fear, fatigue, and trauma were constant companions, yet discipline, training, and camaraderie allowed them to act decisively. These soldiers were ordinary men performing extraordinary feats, their collective courage altering the course of history. Visual/B-roll: close-ups of soldiers' faces, mud-streaked, exhausted, resolute, hands clasping rifles, eyes scanning the horizon. The human cost, however, was undeniable. Many would carry the scars of these nights for the rest of their lives, both physical and emotional. Yet the story of Guadalcanal became a beacon of what determination and unity can achieve, even when facing overwhelming adversity. The two nights demonstrated that warfare is not won solely with numbers or firepower, but with courage, ingenuity, and the will to survive and protect what matters most. Visual: sunset over Henderson Field, smoke rising, soldiers tending to wounded, flags waving solemnly. Even as the Marines caught their breath, they knew the battle for Guadalcanal was far from over. Japanese forces would regroup, reinforce, and attempt new assaults. The stakes remained astronomical. Control of the island meant control of the air, sea routes, and the strategic initiative in the South Pacific. The men understood that holding Henderson Field tonight was just one chapter in a war that would demand every ounce of strength, strategy, and courage they could muster. Visual: map animation showing potential enemy reinforcements, strategic points highlighted, Henderson Field in red. In the coming days, the Marines' resilience would be tested again. Supply lines remained tenuous, disease and malnutrition threatened, and enemy attacks loomed on the horizon. Yet these 840 men had already proven that tenacity and strategy could defy overwhelming odds. Their example would inspire every soldier who followed, creating a legacy of heroism and tactical brilliance that historians would study for decades. Visual/B-roll: Marines repairing positions, rationing supplies, patrolling jungle trails, silhouettes against rising sun. The story of Guadalcanal is more than a tale of military strategy. It is a story of human spirit under extreme conditions. It is a reminder that even in the face of seemingly insurmountable adversity, preparation, leadership, courage, and camaraderie can create outcomes that defy logic. These 840 Marines, holding off 3,000 Japanese soldiers for 2 nights, embody this truth, a legacy of bravery, sacrifice, and determination etched into history forever. Visual: slow motion of Marines standing on the ridge, sunrise reflecting on helmets, smoke dissipating, jungle quieting. As we reflect on these events, we are left with one undeniable question: how many more battles would test the limits of human endurance, strategy, and courage? The Guadalcanal campaign was only the beginning of a long, grueling war in the Pacific, a war that would demand even greater sacrifices and produce even more acts of heroism. Visual/B-roll: fade to horizon. Distant silhouettes of ships and planes, jungle trails, hinting at ongoing conflict. The legacy of these nights lives on not only in history books, but in the very essence of military strategy and human resilience.